I had been telling people for almost 2 months that I was moving back to America. I told my friends here in the Philippines. I told my daughter. I even started looking at flights. In my head, the decision was already made. I was going home. Then one Saturday morning, I sat down with a notebook and actually figured out what going home was going to cost me. Not the plane ticket. Everything after the plane ticket. An apartment, a deposit, utilities, a car, insurance, furniture, groceries, health expenses, all the ordinary things I hadn't paid for in America in a long time. And somewhere around the second page of numbers, I stopped writing, because I realized something that honestly scared me more than moving overseas ever had. I could afford to fly back to the United States. I wasn't sure I could afford to live there. And that's a very different problem. My name isn't important. I'm just a retired American who came to the Philippines because I thought my money would go further here. And it did. That part wasn't a lie. What I didn't understand was that after living here for a while, the cost difference could make returning to America feel almost impossible. I never expected that. When I first moved to the Philippines, I wasn't trying to reinvent myself. I wasn't chasing some big adventure. I wasn't moving here because I hated America. My reasons were actually pretty boring. I was retired. I had a fixed monthly income. And every year it seemed like more of that income disappeared before I even got a chance to enjoy it. My rent went up. Car insurance went up. Food went up. Utilities went up. Every time I opened an email or an envelope, somebody wanted another $20, $50, $100. None of those increases destroyed me by themselves. That was the frustrating part. I could still pay everything. But I was reaching the point where I felt like retirement was becoming a game of trying not to spend money. I had spent most of my adult life working. I thought retirement was supposed to be when I finally stopped worrying about every little purchase. Instead, I was standing in grocery store aisles comparing 2 jars of spaghetti sauce because one was 70 cents cheaper. That's not exactly how I pictured it. I started watching videos about retiring overseas. Mexico, Thailand, Vietnam, the Philippines. At first it was entertainment. Then I started paying attention to the numbers. Rent was what caught me. I kept seeing apartments and small houses for amounts that wouldn't get me much of anything where I was living in the United States. Then I started looking at food, transportation, phone service, eating out once in a while without feeling guilty about it. Pretty soon, I had another notebook. I seemed to solve a lot of my problems with notebooks. And according to that notebook, I could live in the Philippines comfortably on my retirement income and still have money left at the end of the month. That hadn't happened to me in years. So I came over. I didn't sell some giant house. There was no dramatic goodbye. I rented anyway, so I finished my lease, gave away some furniture, sold my car, kept the things that mattered, and came to the Philippines with enough savings that I thought I had protected myself from making a terrible mistake. I also had a round-trip ticket. That mattered to me. Because I remember telling my daughter, if I hate it, I'll come back. And I believed that completely. For about the first year, I didn't hate it. I liked it more than I expected. My rent was manageable. I didn't need a car. I could go out for lunch occasionally without calculating what else I needed to give up that week. I wasn't living some luxury lifestyle. That's important. I wasn't sitting beside a swimming pool every afternoon with somebody bringing me drinks. I had normal days. Laundry, grocery shopping, power bills, waiting for deliveries, trying to figure out why something I ordered online looked completely different when it arrived. Normal life, just cheaper. And for a while, that was enough. Then something changed. Not the Philippines, me. The excitement wore off. The place that had felt new started feeling ordinary. And once it became ordinary, I started noticing everything I missed. I missed driving on familiar roads. I missed certain foods. I missed being able to understand every conversation happening around me. I missed seeing my daughter without having to plan it months ahead. I missed walking into a store and already knowing where everything was. Those sound like little things. But little things are strange. You can ignore one, you can ignore 10. Then one day you wake up irritated because you can't find the kind of coffee creamer you used to buy back home. And suddenly you're questioning every decision you've made for the last 2 years. That's basically what happened to me. I started thinking about America constantly. Not the America I had actually left, a better version, the comfortable version, the familiar version. And pretty soon I convinced myself of something. I didn't belong here anymore. It was time to go home. The problem was, I hadn't yet figured out what home was going to cost. Once I decided I was going back, I started doing what I probably should have done before announcing it to everybody. I started checking prices. The first thing I looked at was rent. I wasn't expecting to move back into the same neighborhood I had left. I knew prices had gone up. I figured I'd find a basic one-bedroom apartment somewhere outside the expensive areas, keep things simple, and rebuild from there. That sounded reasonable. Then I started clicking through listings. The first apartment I liked was more than twice what I was paying in the Philippines. The second one looked cheaper until I read the fees. Parking, trash, pet fee, even though I didn't have a pet. Some kind of monthly service charge I still don't completely understand. Then there was the deposit, application fee, utility deposits. And most of these places wanted proof that my monthly income was several times the rent. I sat there thinking, I have retirement income. I have savings. I can pay the rent. Why does this already feel difficult? But rent was only one piece. I would need transportation. Where I had been looking, living without a car would have been possible in theory. In reality, not for the kind of daily life I wanted. So I started looking at used cars. That was my second surprise. Cars I remembered buying for a few $1,000s were suddenly listed for numbers that made me check whether I had accidentally clicked on something newer. Then insurance, registration, fuel, maintenance. I hadn't even bought the car yet, and it was already costing me money in my head. My daughter kept telling me not to panic. She said I could stay with her at first. And I appreciated that. I really did. But she has her own life, her own schedule, her own responsibilities. I didn't retire so I could move into my daughter's house and slowly become another problem she had to organize around. She never made me feel that way. That was coming from me. But it mattered. I wanted my own place, my own routine, my own front door. So I kept calculating. I added what I thought groceries might cost, phone service, internet, health insurance expenses that were different from what I was dealing with overseas, basic household stuff, a bed, a table, cookware, towels, all the boring things you don't think about until you don't own them anymore. And that's when it hit me that I hadn't just moved away from America. I had dismantled my American life. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough of it was gone that coming back meant starting over. And starting over in the United States was expensive. The number I came up with wasn't impossible. That's important. I don't want to exaggerate this. I wasn't broke. I wasn't trapped in the Philippines with $20 in my bank account. I could have returned. But doing it the way I wanted would have meant pulling a large amount from my savings almost immediately. Then my monthly expenses would have gone up enough that I would probably be dipping into those savings every month after that. That scared me, because those savings weren't fun money. That was my emergency money. Medical problems, unexpected travel, something happening to my daughter, something happening to me. The money that was supposed to make retirement feel secure. And suddenly going home meant spending a big chunk of it just to recreate the basic life I had already given up. I remember sitting at my table here in the Philippines staring at that notebook. The fan was running. Somebody outside was selling something from a motorcycle with a speaker that I couldn't understand. A dog had been barking on and off for about 20 minutes. Normally, all of that would have irritated me. That morning, I barely noticed it. I was too busy looking at the number at the bottom of the page. And I thought, what have I done? That was the first time I felt trapped. Not because anyone was keeping me in the Philippines. Not because I couldn't buy a ticket. I could leave whenever I wanted. But for the first time, I understood that leaving and rebuilding were two completely different things. And once that thought got into my head, I started getting angry. Mostly at myself. I told myself I had been stupid. I should have kept the car longer. I should have stored more things. I should have thought further ahead. Maybe I should never have moved overseas in the first place. Then I started blaming the Philippines too, which wasn't fair. But fear isn't always fair. Suddenly the heat bothered me more. The noise bothered me more. Traffic bothered me more. If the internet went down for 20 minutes, it became another reason America was better. If I couldn't find something at the grocery store, same thing. Every inconvenience became proof that I needed to leave. And every time I opened an American rental website, I was reminded that leaving might cost more than I was comfortable paying. I spent about 3 weeks like that, wanting to go, afraid to go, resenting myself for staying, and not allowing myself to enjoy anything because I had already decided this part of my life was supposed to be over. Then my daughter asked me a question that irritated me when she first said it. She asked, "Are you trying to move home because you're unhappy there? Or are you unhappy there because you've decided you should move home?" I told her that sounded like the same thing. She said it wasn't. And after we hung up, I kept thinking about it. Because if I was being fair, my life in the Philippines hadn't suddenly become terrible. My rent hadn't changed, my friends were still here, I was still living within my income. Nothing major had happened. The only thing that had really changed was what I had started telling myself about where I was supposed to be. A few days later, I did something that changed the way I looked at the whole situation. I booked a trip back to the United States. Not to move, not yet. I told myself I was going to spend a few weeks with my daughter, look at apartments in person, maybe check out some used cars, and see whether the numbers felt different once I was actually there. Because looking at prices online from the Philippines can mess with your head. Everything is just a number on a screen. I wanted to know what returning would actually feel like. And I'll admit, as the trip got closer, I became excited. Really excited. I started thinking about all the things I was going to do. Foods I hadn't eaten in a long time. Stores I wanted to visit. Driving again. Seeing my daughter without staring at her through a phone. Even stupid little things. I remember thinking about walking into a grocery store and buying the exact cereal I wanted. You spend enough time overseas, and apparently cereal becomes emotional. When I landed in America, those first few days were great. My daughter picked me up. We stopped for food on the way back to her place. I slept better than I expected. The weather felt familiar. Everything sounded familiar. I could understand every conversation around me without even trying. For about 3 days, I thought, yep, this is it. I'm coming back. Then normal life started. My daughter went back to work. She had things to do, appointments, errands, her own plans. And suddenly I wasn't on this emotional homecoming anymore. I was just a retired guy sitting in somebody else's house on a Tuesday morning. That wasn't her fault. She had told me I could stay as long as I needed. But I didn't want to stay as long as I needed. I wanted my own place. So I started touring apartments. The first one looked pretty good online. In person, it was smaller than I expected, and the neighborhood wasn't somewhere I really wanted to live. Still, I thought maybe I could make it work. Then the leasing agent gave me the paperwork. By the time she explained the rent, deposit, fees, and what I would need before moving in, I was already doing math in my head. I thanked her, walked back outside, sat in the rental car, and just stared through the windshield. The second apartment was nicer. It was also more expensive. The third was cheaper, but I would have needed a car for almost everything. Then I started looking at cars again. Not nice cars. I wasn't shopping for some brand new truck. I was looking for a reliable used vehicle that could get me to the grocery store, doctor, pharmacy, and wherever else I needed to go. Every decent option seemed to push my starting costs higher. Then I got an insurance quote. Whew, that one hurt. And remember, I was already paying for a rental car during this visit. Every day I stayed in America, I could practically watch money leaving my account. Gas, food, a couple things I needed from the store, parking once or twice. Nothing extravagant. It was just expensive to exist. One afternoon, I stopped at a grocery store by myself. I walked around putting things in the cart almost automatically. Coffee, eggs, bread, some fruit, a few things for dinner. Stuff I had bought hundreds of times before I ever moved overseas. When I got to the register and saw the total, I actually looked back into the cart. I thought maybe I had forgotten something expensive in there. I hadn't. And that was the moment when my memory of America started colliding with the America I was actually standing in. Because when I was sitting in the Philippines missing home, I wasn't remembering this part. I remembered convenience. I remembered familiarity. I remembered family. I remembered having a car. What I didn't remember was how much money that entire system required every month. I had been comparing my current life in the Philippines with an old version of my American life. And the old version didn't exist anymore. Prices had changed. My circumstances had changed. I had changed. A few nights later, my daughter and I were sitting at her kitchen table. She asked how the apartment search was going. I told her the truth, not very well. Then she said I could live with her. Not temporarily. She meant permanently if I wanted. And for a few seconds, I considered it. It would solve a lot of the financial problem. No huge apartment deposit, no rush to furnish an entire place. I could help around the house. I would be close to family. On paper, it made sense. But I looked around that kitchen and realized something. This was her home, her routine, her life. I would be fitting myself into it. Back in the Philippines, I had my own place, my own schedule, my own friends. I decided when I ate, when I went out, when I did absolutely nothing all afternoon. For all the things I had been complaining about, I had independence. And sitting there in America, I started wondering whether I had been so focused on what I missed that I had forgotten what I would be giving up. I still wasn't ready to admit I wanted to stay in the Philippines, but for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to leave either. I stayed in America for another 2 weeks, and during that time, something unexpected happened. I stopped feeling like I was deciding whether America was better than the Philippines. I started asking a different question. Which life actually made sense for me now? Because I couldn't recreate the life I remembered, that version was gone. I no longer had the apartment I once rented. I no longer had my car. Most of the furniture I owned was gone. Some friends had moved. Other people had changed jobs, remarried, retired, or simply become harder to see. Even my daughter had a busier life than she did when I left. None of that was bad. It was just reality. The America I kept missing had continued moving without me. One afternoon, I drove through an area where I used to spend a lot of time. I knew every street, every traffic light, every shortcut. It felt familiar, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. That's difficult to explain. I wasn't a tourist. I knew the place too well for that. But I also wasn't living there. I was somewhere in between. And I realized I had felt that exact same way during my first months in the Philippines, like I was standing inside somebody else's routine, trying to figure out where I fit. The difference was, in the Philippines, I had eventually built one. I had a barber I went to, a grocery store I knew, a little place where I liked to eat lunch, people who recognized me, a landlord I knew how to deal with, neighbors whose habits used to annoy me but had somehow become part of the background of my day. It wasn't spectacular. That was actually the point. It was ordinary. It was mine. And I had nearly thrown it away because I was homesick for another ordinary life that no longer existed exactly the way I remembered it. That didn't solve the money problem. If anything, it made me face it more honestly. I ran the numbers again while I was staying with my daughter. This time I didn't use the cheapest apartment I could find. I used one I would actually feel comfortable living in. I added realistic transportation costs, insurance, food, utilities, a little money for entertainment, a little money for emergencies. Nothing fancy, just a decent retirement. Then I compared it with what I was actually spending in the Philippines. The difference was larger than I wanted to admit. If I moved back, I could probably make it work for a while, but I would be watching my savings slowly decrease. Maybe not dramatically, maybe not every month, but enough that I knew I would start thinking about money the same way I did before I left. Can I afford this? Should I wait? What if something happens next year? What if I need more medical care later? What if I live longer than I planned for financially? That last question stayed with me, because retirement is strange. You spend your working years hoping you've saved enough to live a long time. Then, once you're retired, living a long time becomes one of the things you have to budget for. The night before my flight back to the Philippines, my daughter asked me what I had decided. I told her I was going back. She looked surprised. Not disappointed, just surprised. Then she asked me if I was going back because I wanted to, or because I couldn't afford to stay. That was the question I had been avoiding. I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was uncomfortable. Money was part of it, a big part, but it wasn't the whole answer anymore. If I absolutely wanted to live in America, I could make sacrifices and do it. I could live with her longer. I could choose a cheaper area. I could spend some savings. I could rebuild slowly. There were options. They just weren't options I liked more than the life I already had. And that distinction mattered. For weeks I had been telling myself I was trapped in the Philippines. Sitting there with my daughter, I finally realized I wasn't trapped. I was choosing between two imperfect lives. One was familiar but expensive. The other was affordable but far from the people I loved. Neither one gave me everything. For some reason, accepting that made the decision easier. I wasn't searching for the perfect country anymore. I was trying to choose the set of problems I could actually live with. And for me, at least for now, those problems were in the Philippines. When I landed back in the Philippines, I expected to feel disappointed. I thought maybe the airport heat would hit me, and I'd immediately start questioning the decision again. Instead, something much quieter happened. I felt relieved. Not excited, not emotional, just relieved. I knew where I was going. I knew what my apartment looked like. I knew where I would buy groceries the next morning. I knew what my monthly expenses would probably be. And after spending weeks trying to rebuild an American life on paper, that predictability suddenly felt valuable. The first few days back were strange. I noticed the things that had bothered me before. The traffic was still traffic. The heat was still hot. The internet still had moments when it decided to test my patience. Nothing had magically improved because I had chosen to return. But I wasn't looking at those things the same way anymore. Before my trip, every inconvenience had become evidence that I had made a mistake. Now it was just an inconvenience. That was a big difference. I also changed a few things. I stopped pretending that saving as much money as possible was the only goal. I upgraded a couple things in the apartment that had been bothering me. Nothing extravagant, a better chair, a small appliance I kept putting off buying. I started taking a car more often instead of always choosing the cheapest transportation. And once a week, I gave myself permission to go somewhere I liked, without calculating whether staying home would save another few dollars. That might sound small, but I had fallen into the same habit I had before leaving America. I was letting the fear of future expenses control the present. The whole reason I moved to the Philippines was to get some breathing room. Then I started using that breathing room to worry about money anyway. Apparently, you can move halfway around the world and still bring your habits with you. I also became more serious about my connection with America. Before, I treated visiting my daughter like something I would do whenever it felt convenient. That was a mistake. Distance feels much worse when there is no next date on the calendar. So we started planning ahead. Not perfectly, not every detail, but enough that I knew when I expected to see her again. That helped more than I thought it would. I stopped feeling like I had chosen one country and abandoned the other. I lived in the Philippines. My daughter lived in America. Both things could be true without turning every goodbye into some kind of final decision. And I want to be careful about something. I don't think everyone in my situation should stay overseas. If you hate living abroad, money alone probably isn't a good enough reason to spend the rest of your life somewhere you don't want to be. There are things more important than cheap rent: family, health, community, feeling safe, feeling like you belong somewhere. I learned that. But I also learned that going back to America isn't automatically the solution just because America feels familiar. You have to look at the life you would actually return to, not the one you remember, not the one you had 10 years ago, the one you can afford today. For me, that changed everything. I had spent months telling myself I couldn't afford to go home. Eventually, I realized that wasn't quite accurate. I could afford to return. What I couldn't afford was to recreate my old life exactly the way I remembered it. And once I stopped demanding that, the situation felt less frightening. Because I didn't need my old life back. I needed a life that worked now. Today, I'm still in the Philippines. My expenses are manageable. I have more room in my budget than I would have if I moved back. I still miss America sometimes. I miss my daughter. I miss things that are difficult to explain unless you've lived away from your home country for a while. And there are still days when I wonder whether I'll eventually return. I'm not making promises about where I'll spend the rest of my life. I've learned not to do that. But I'm also not sitting here anymore feeling like I'm trapped. That's probably the biggest change. I stayed. At first, I thought I stayed because moving home cost too much. Now I see it differently. The money forced me to slow down long enough to actually compare the two lives in front of me. And when I did, I realized the Philippines still gave me something I wasn't ready to give up. Independence, a manageable retirement, and enough financial breathing room to enjoy some of the years I worked so hard to reach. Maybe one day that calculation changes. If it does, I'll deal with it then. But right now, I'm not here because I failed to make it home. I'm here because, for the life I have today, staying makes more sense. And this time, it feels like my decision. The biggest mistake I made wasn't moving to the Philippines. It wasn't selling my car. It wasn't getting rid of furniture. And it wasn't deciding for a while that I wanted to go back to America. The mistake was believing one decision had to solve the rest of my life. When I first came here, I wanted certainty. I wanted to know I had chosen the right country. Then, when I became homesick, I wanted the opposite kind of certainty. I wanted somebody to tell me going back to America would fix everything. Neither one was realistic. Retirement doesn't suddenly become simple because you move somewhere cheaper. You still get lonely. You still worry about money. You still miss people. You still have mornings when you wake up wondering whether you made the right choices. The difference is that I can handle those things better now because I'm not pretending they mean I have to immediately change my entire life. If I'm homesick, I can visit. If something here stops working for me, I can adjust. If someday I truly want to return to America, I can plan for it instead of panicking and trying to rebuild everything overnight. That sounds obvious now. It wasn't obvious when I was sitting at that table, convinced I had trapped myself on the other side of the world. And if you're thinking about retiring overseas, there's one thing I would do differently. Before you calculate whether you can afford to leave America, calculate what it would cost to come back. Really calculate it. Not just airfare, housing, deposits, transportation, furniture, insurance, the things you'll sell, the things you'll have to replace, and especially the monthly income you'll need once you're back. Because moving overseas can lower your cost of living so much that after a few years, American prices can feel completely different. That doesn't mean you shouldn't move. It just means you should keep your options open. I wish I had thought about that sooner. But there's another side to this too. Don't let fear of being unable to return prevent you from building a good life somewhere else. For a while, that's exactly what I was doing. I was sitting in an apartment I could afford, in a country where I had built a routine, spending every evening thinking about a life thousands of miles away. I wasn't enjoying America. I wasn't enjoying the Philippines. I was living somewhere in between. That's no way to retire. So now I try to pay attention to the life directly in front of me. This morning I got coffee from the same place I usually go. The woman behind the counter recognized me before I ordered. Later, I bought groceries. I came home. I talked to my daughter. Nothing exciting happened. And that's exactly why I noticed it. This isn't a vacation anymore. It isn't an experiment. It's just my life. Maybe that's what I had been searching for the whole time. Not the cheapest country. Not the perfect retirement. Not some place where nothing ever goes wrong. Just a life I can afford, and one that still feels like my own. I used to say I couldn't afford to move home. I don't say that anymore. Home isn't one apartment, one city, or even one country. And staying in the Philippines doesn't mean I've closed the door on America. It just means I'm not walking through that door simply because I'm afraid to stay where I am. For now, this works. For now, I'm staying. And after everything I went through trying to make that decision, for now is finally enough.